Springtime in the garden. Let's chat about some of the things you can do in your garden in spring. And if you are enrolled in my online gardening course, be sure to watch this video in the course. As I talk about these things, I will link to other areas in the course where you can learn about them in more detail. And if you're not enrolled in the course, I will give you a link down below where you can enroll in the course. Let's start with soil. Soil testing and fertilizing, these are good things to do in the spring or the fall. You really can do them any time of year, but it's especially nice when you don't have a lot of plants growing because you can incorporate fertilizers into the top couple of inches of soil. So you can dig into the soil, you can learn a little bit about your soil yourself, and you can send a sample off to a lab to learn more about the specific nutrient imbalances you have in your soil. Then when you get that data back, you can fertilize based on those imbalances. So early spring is a great time to do that. Then in terms of more broad spectrum fertilizing, I don't do too much of this too early in the spring, but 2 to 4 weeks before planting, I will go out and do a spray of some kind. As I've said before, my main sprays are usually some kind of microbial inoculant mixed with at least one fertilizer, if not multiple fertilizers. So my main inoculant is effective microorganisms. My main fertilizer is a liquid seaweed and sea minerals or an ocean water, maybe a little bit of blackstrap molasses in there, mixed in water, spray it on the soil. In this case, we don't have plants growing yet, but spray it on the trunks of trees and on the compost pile and all over the whole garden. Occasionally, I'll substitute in some compost tea or something like that, but that happens sometime in the spring. Then we get on to preparing our garden beds, and we don't want to work the soil too early or when it's wet still, but once it's dried out enough and once it's workable, you may do something to prepare your garden for planting. I don't do much tilling, but if you do tilling, this is the time to do that. It's a good time of year to spread a little bit of compost and sort of lightly rake that or incorporate that into the soil and start preparing your seed bed for planting. If you have new beds to prepare, you want to do that, and whether you do tilling or double digging or sheet mulching or something else, now is the time of year to do that. If you have existing beds that you have a thick mulch on, you at some point, once it's getting a little bit warmer, like maybe when the frost is done, if you have frost where you are, you may pull that mulch aside for a little while to allow the soil to warm up. And then once you get planting later in the spring, you can put a little bit of that mulch back on. And then eventually, once the plants are bigger, like 4 to 8 inches tall, you can put more mulch on and really use your mulch to block some of the weeds and to enrich the soil. Sometime when we're preparing our beds, if you have a cover crop, you'll want to hoe or till or do something to that cover crop to either incorporate it into the soil or just leave it as a mulch or pull it aside, whatever you do with it. This happens at this time of year. Some people also may bring out something else to warm up the soil and prepare for planting, like black plastic or clear plastic or a floating row cover or a hoop house or a cold frame, something to get that soil warmed up. This is the time of year when we get ready for planting. Next, we get into planting and sowing seed. Most of this happens in the spring and over maybe a 2-month period. There are a few crops that go in very early, like right when you're still preparing your soil, like peas, for example, can go in even when it's snowing, you might put your peas in. Kale can go in very early, but mostly we're waiting until after the last frost to plant most things. And there are some plant families that really want the soil to be quite warm, like the tomato family and peppers and the squash family with melons and squash and zucchini. You really need the soil to be warm. So that's why some of these things happen earlier in the spring, some things happen quite late in spring. And as I mentioned in the winter video, I really encourage you to get a planting calendar of some kind. And every country has some kind of planting calendar, and you really need to find one for your region. So I'll say again, in the US, in Canada, I like there's a Burpee calendar online where you enter a zip code. And if you're in Canada, you have to find a zip code that sort of matches your USDA zone. And they will spit out a huge planting list to tell you when to start seeds indoors, when to plant things outdoors. It's really quite nice. I will say this again, I know I said it in the winter video, but what I do is after I've put in the zip code and selected a couple plants, there's a link that says click here to view and print dates. If you click that, it will just give you this huge many-page list of all the main crops, and it's really helpful. You can download that. The other thing I'll mention is I really love to consult a biodynamic calendar. And biodynamics is something that's pretty out there. I'm not going to talk about it in detail here, but they have really interesting ideas about planting. There's the Maria Thun calendar, the Stella Natura calendar. In Canada, there's one called the Celestial Planting Calendar. You can buy these things. There's also like Farmer's Almanac calendars. You can buy some really cool things that's fun to take with you into the garden. So planting, that is the big thing for spring. The other thing that happens in spring that catches a lot of new gardeners off guard is if you will be planting a fall crop, you start thinking about that now. If you want to plant brassicas in the fall, you will start those inside sometime in like the late spring, early summer. That's your broccoli and cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, but also just making sure you have the seeds that you want to plant in the summer for harvest in the fall. So that thinking happens now. There's not much pruning that happens in spring. Maybe if you have some spring flowering shrubs, you wait until they're done flowering and you prune soon after that to give them time to be ready to flower again the following spring. If you do pruning, that's the time to do that. But mostly we're not doing much pruning. We don't really prune fruit trees after they've flowered because we want those flowers to develop into fruit. So spring, the main things, like when I get into spring, I'm thinking early spring, I'm thinking, am I going to do a soil test and then fertilize based on that test? I am going to be preparing my garden beds, starting to do some fertilizing, and then getting into planting. And spring is all about planting and kind of gradually mulching those plants. And the last thing is I'm thinking about my fall garden already. Do I need to start anything inside? Do I need to order seeds? That is spring. So I will give you a few links down below, and I will give you a link right here.